This is a story about something eternal. Richard Myers was born in 1949 in Lexington, Kentucky. Growing up, he loved westerns, John Ford and Howard Hawks movies, the Lone Ranger TV show, and one of the things he learned from those westerns was that you needed a sidekick. Lone Ranger and Tonto, John Wayne and Dean Martin in Rio Bravo. Richard thought you needed someone to conspire with, someone to help you maintain the nerve to carry out your ideas. Richard would eventually find a friend like that, and together they would start one of the most important bands in music history, and become some of the forefathers of a completely new subgenre of music. And then they would have a falling out that they never reconciled. Growing up in Kentucky, Richard had a pretty normal childhood until his father passed away when he was 7. His home life wasn't horrible, but Richard wanted to escape. Even as a young kid, he was making plans to run away. His grades started falling, he started getting in trouble in school, doing things like building homemade explosives and stealing cars and going joyriding. But despite all that, he was smart enough to get a scholarship to a private school. He moved schools and states a lot before finally winding up at a boarding school in Delaware. And it was there that he met this quiet kid named Tom Miller. Richard and Tom became best friends. They shared a sense of humor, they both liked writing and poetry. Richard at this time was obsessed with Dylan Thomas. And they both liked music, although their musical tastes were pretty different. Tom loved free jazz, while Richard had grown up listening to stuff like the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and Bob Dylan. Neither of them had really thought about becoming professional musicians, especially not Richard. He had taken clarinet lessons as a kid, but said that practicing learning an instrument was boring, and he thought that the idea of somebody like him getting to make records seemed inconceivable. Neither Tom or Richard had any interest in school, and one day when Richard was 17 and Tom was 16, Richard said, "Let's take off." And Tom said, "Okay." They had this idea that they would go be poets in Florida, even though they'd never been to Florida and didn't know anything about it. They hitchhiked most of the way and made it as far as southeast Alabama before they finally got caught. They were both expelled from their private school. Tom decided to go to public school in Delaware, but Richard decided he was done with school and he moved to New York City. In New York, he bounced around to different cheap apartments, living with a bunch of different roommates. He worked a bunch of odd minimum wage jobs, and he tried to make it as a poet. In 1968, he actually started his own poetry magazine. It was called Genesis:"Grasp." And all the while, he kept in touch with Tom Miller. They would exchange letters back and forth. Tom eventually finished high school, then went to university, but he dropped out and he ends up moving to New York City too. Now with Richard and Tom both in New York together, they become even more inseparable. They were so close that people thought they were brothers. They wrote poems together, they even created an alter ego called Teresa Stern, and they even came up with a face for her. It was Tom and Richard in drag with their faces superimposed over each other. And then in the early 1970s, Richard saw a band that would change everything. It was a band called the New York Dolls. He said that those New York Dolls shows were something that could never be captured on record. Their shows were like orgies. Funny, dirty, religious revel. One early Dolls show saw the New York Dolls with the Modern Lovers and with Patti Smith, the poet, before she was making music, just on stage reading poetry. The whole scene blew Tom and Richard away so much that they decided they had to start a band together. Now, Tom already knew how to play guitar. He had an acoustic that he would play a lot. Richard didn't know how to play any instrument, but he didn't let that stop him. He decided he would play bass in their new band. He figured as a poet, his strength would be writing lyrics for the band, and Tom and Richard decided to be co-lead singers and lyricists. They got this drummer named Billy, and they started a band called the Neon Boys. They were influenced not just by the Dolls and the Modern Lovers, but by bands like the Stooges, glam bands like T-Rex, 60s garage bands like the Seeds. Richard's primary goal was to have a band that breathed new life into rock and roll. They decided they needed a second guitar player, so they put out an ad in the Village Voice that said, "Narcissistic rhythm guitar player wanted, minimal talent okay." They had some interesting characters come up to audition for the Neon Boys. One of them was this guy Doug Colvin, whose guitar playing was so bad that he didn't even meet the minimal talent threshold. He would later become Dee Dee Ramone in the Ramones. There was also a guy named Chris Stein, who was good, but they decided he was too mellow and didn't look cool enough. He would later go on to found Blondie. While Tom loved the part of the band that was writing songs and getting better at playing guitar, Richard was about trying to create his own subculture. Taking cues from the Dolls, he wanted fashion to be a part of the band. He wore black jeans and ripped clothing that he held together with safety pins. He cut his hair short and jagged, wore leather jackets. And the clothes that he wore on the streets would be the same clothes that the band wore on stage. There was no separation for Richard. He He said that rock and roll was the lifestyle, and the songs were just byproducts of it. He said everything he was doing for the band had meaning and purpose. It seemed like the only thing that didn't fit was their names, Richard Myers and Tom Miller. So they changed them to Richard Hell and Tom Verlaine. And by late 1973, they changed the name of the band too, from the Neon Boys to Television. They also finally found that second guitar player, this guy named Richard Lloyd, but that's where the problems between Richard and Tom started. When the band played their first show as Television in 1974, Richard thought the show went great. He said it was rough, it was ragged, but people were stunned. As far as he was concerned, the band did their job, but Tom was humiliated. He had a certain sound in his head that he wanted for Television, and Richard didn't really fit in that vision.
In the chorus, you play an E run first.
I don't know what's the chorus, what the chorus in the song.
Okay. Do you know where the E is? There's only one E in the song. When we go to the E. Right, that's the chorus.
But Richard continued playing with Television throughout 1974, including when the band found a new home. They found this dive bar on the Bowery that had just changed its name from Country Bluegrass Blues to CBGB's. Television talked owner Hilly Kristal into letting them play there, and starting in March of 1974, Television started playing CBGB's and building a huge buzz. Pretty soon, other bands started playing there. That poet, Patti Smith, she put together a group called the Patti Smith Group. She was also dating Tom at this time. Then there was the Ramones, Blondie, there was Talking Heads. Television, along with these bands, became the epicenter of something that would later be called punk. One of the guys hanging around this scene at this time was this guy Malcolm McLaren, who was from England. He had come to America to manage the New York Dolls towards the end of their career. He was also friendly with Richard Hell, and might have taken some of Richard Hell's unique fashion with him when he went back to England to start managing the Sex Pistols. But going into 1975, Tom and Richard's relationship had fallen apart. Tom was frustrated that Richard couldn't play, and he said his jumping around on stage too much was distracting. Richard thought Tom was power-hungry and insufferable. Richard said that Tom shut him out. He stopped letting any of Richard's songs be included on the set lists, and then when Virgin Records asked the band to record a demo, Tom made sure that none of Richard's songs were recorded. That was the final straw for Richard Hell, and he quit the band. He was replaced by Blondie's then bass player Fred Smith. Richard would go on to start a band with some of the former members of the New York Dolls, like Johnny Thunders, called the Heartbreakers. Then he had his own group called Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and he got to record some of those songs he had written for Television. Songs like Love Comes in Spurts and Blank Generation, songs that became early punk classics. And of course, Television in 1977 would release their debut album, Marquee Moon, which is widely considered one of the greatest albums of all time, even if Television never did reach the commercial success of some of their CBGB's counterparts. After 2 albums with the Voidoids, Richard Hell basically left the music industry in the early 1980s. Him and Tom never reconciled, even up to Tom Verlaine's death in 2023. Richard said that they couldn't stand each other, but going through what they had gone through together created an eternal bond. Writing in his 2013 autobiography, I Dreamed I Was a Very Clean Tramp, Richard wrote about Tom and thought back to that time that they had run away from school together as teenagers. He remembered the diners that they would stop at. They would sit together in the middle of the night, drinking coffee, just talking and laughing. He said, "I don't know if I can quite get back to our states of consciousness to describe the pleasure of those days after we took off from school. In one sense, they provided a template for the future, but in another way, they're irretrievable."
I was saying let me out of here before I was even born. It's such a gamble when you get a face